What? Ah. I've never heard that before.
I wish we would have done that.
Okay. So, a couple things in that reading through them all, DBQs on Tuesday, and yeah, it's really terrible. It's not gonna be like that. I don't think we're gonna be like the west of the continental line. We're getting 70, 80 miles per hour. That's fine. Shut down, no school. They should be up to us. Hey, I mean, it's just. Man. We need to cancel school. Huh? We need to cancel school. You know, you don't want school to be canceled. It's pretty stupid. If we do it, if you do it again, we'd have to make it. And you make it up, that would mean either a Saturday school or an extra, you know, like one day a week we do it after 10 minutes in each box or 15 minutes. Which is not pleasant. You don't want to make it up. Yeah, great. You get one day off or you get to go for 3 hours to sit home. What are you gonna do? So it's better to not have that. And we did this, like, a bunch of places shut down their schools a few years ago. Must have been 8 or 9 years ago, I guess, looking back at it. They shut down school because they thought a huge storm was coming in. So they shut it down and it turned out it wasn't that bad. And so we kind of got burnt by that. So that's why we're just not going to do it. I can't imagine this would be too bad, but you never know. You know,
Still did. Weird to say it. For a long time.
well, it wouldn't be long then. Freshman, we have to, I think, having lunch, call the herd. All right, everybody. DBQ on Tuesday. I posted everything I gave you before on the DBQ. You should have that information. Start going through it. I'll remind you again on Tuesday. But it should be pretty quick to come back. So we got here, didn't we? Social unity. And did we get to here?
No.
So the target.
Oh, wait.
So I got most of the espionage acts graded, but my prep period, first period today, I was going to finish it, and I ended up not finishing them. I ended up reading the news about our latest war. That was very disturbing. It's incredibly disturbing right now. And so, while reading that, and yeah, when right before class, I read an article by the foreign policy expert of the Wall Street Journal, but he was like, now Iran's in control of the finish of this war. And I'm like, oh boy, things are not going well. Because they decide when the war ends now. And so I got distracted. That's me not budgeting my time. So back to this. So let's look at the law really quick, and we'll come back and review a few things as we go on. But I put this separate. No, you have to read the whole thing. But it says, whoever when the United States at war shall willfully make or convey false reports. And this part we kind of got. False statements, you can read that. You already read it. It's success of the naval forces. Promote the success of the enemies, convey false reports, incite insubordination. Here's a big one. Obstruct the recruiting or enlistment services of the United States. That means protesting the what? The draft. But here we get to the big. So you have all this, and okay, this is hard to define, but okay. But then, shall willfully utter, print, write, publish, or any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military naval forces of the United States. What does that mean? Let me ask you another question. What does that ban? A lot of people said essentially the same thing. Not everything, isn't it? It bans criticism of the government. Period. Because couldn't any critique of the Wilson administration in 1918, they can argue is abusing language of this form of government while we're at war and will hurt our military and help the Germans? By the way, was spying legal before they passed this law? Was it legal to spy? Was spying illegal before we passed this law? Spying in wartime was a capital offense, meaning execution. It's called the Espionage Act to ban espionage and spying. Spying was already a death sentence. And yes, people were executed for spying in World War I. Would this stop anybody from spying? If you were already a spy, willing to face the death penalty, and they said, oh yeah, and then an additional 20 years, I don't think that's much of a deterrence. You're already going to be executed, or at least life imprisonment. Who is this deterrent? Say it again. Yes. But let's put it that normal. What does normal mean? I'm going to say we are relatively normal. You notice I have the word relatively. Civilians. Regular free speech, doesn't it? Because can you define scurrilous language? No one can. Who defines? Who interprets the laws? Who? The executive does. Then the Supreme Court will look back at the legality of constitutionality. The executive interprets it. And add one more thing. Virtually every state has their own espionage act. So therefore, the government decides. Montana. So it could be anything. What do most people do? Criticize the government? Did you criticize President Wilson? Did you criticize the governor? You might be arrested for it. What do most normal people do if they pass the law? Let me give you an example. People shut up. We're jumping right. Why not? Right. These are 3 people in Montana who were arrested under the Espionage Act. Look what Klippenstein said. So he was unpopular, and I should have. This guy, working class, you mean, he had no political power. That got him arrested. Look at sentence. That's what he said. Wasn't recorded, someone heard him say it. $10 years. He would serve just under 3. When war madness kind of died down. Anybody else want to criticize the war? Normal people shut up. But will it stop spying? Not a bit. The Espionage Act does nothing to stop spying. In fact, who are the only people that are going to talk when you have a law like this? Either spies, or what if you really were determined for the United States? The most radical. And that's what we have to get down. This shuts up everybody, except for the most radical, or people who are actually spies. And so I'm reading your papers, which I didn't quite get finished grading, and they did a good job talking about why they would pass this law. But it doesn't stop spying. There's already a law there. It shuts up your existence. Shuts people. And everyone's afraid to talk. But here's the thing. You get people riled up with 4-minute men, those speeches, the propaganda, and you're going to have vigilantes like the Liberty League, who are out there thinking, oh, if they're passing laws like this, there must be traitors everywhere. And they begin to look out for them and find them, hunt them down. Vigilantes, and as we all know, vigilante mobs are always, the most judicious and only will find the people who are the most guilty, correct? Ooh, the wind is really picking up. So, this is what they want. This is a British poster, but it fits so well. I put it right here. Here it shows regular people with individual, they're very much individuals, aren't they? And what happens? No longer they're individuals. Social conformity, everyone marching together. They show them as soldiers, but that's social unity. Anyone deviates, must be helping the enemy. And so, propaganda, this gives me an excuse to show these cartoons, which are some of my favorites. They're so funny, especially because the artists clearly like this model. But also, it does a little bit of nationalism, but also plays on young men desperately trying to prove they're manly. And so, I love this one. Gee, I wish I were a man, meaning if you don't join up, young men, not a real man. This one is hilarious. Same model with same differences. I want you for the Navy. It's implying that she will date you, young men, if you join up. And I have news for all of you young men who joined up because of her. She's not. Sorry. And this one, it just kind of makes me laugh. But most of them just fear all the enemies. And I say all the enemies. Because enemy is anyone against the war. Anyone who doesn't want you to win the war against the war, they're the enemies. Here, U-boat. Pretty stark one. That's August of 1918 on the right. So that's little Belgium still, poor little Belgium still being used. Don't need to tell you what they're implying here. It's not subtle at all. So you're going to get people riled up, looking for enemies. There must be enemies. And with that will come war madness. With the idea enemies all around. Here, it says spies are listening. Like a web to catch all the information. So be quiet. You notice the Kaiser as a spy or as a web. Here, you have to prove you're a real American. Look at these German atrocities. Blood sausage, bluewurst, sauerkraut, Limburger cheese, German atrocities. I like dogs, but not this. Kill it. Unfortunately, yeah. And yeah, that boy and girl, they're really very much involved in the world political system. They haven't liked Kaiser for years. No, clearly. Adults gave her that sign and said, hold this, already training little kids to hate. That's war madness. So for example, they started changing the name of this. Is that for me? No, I said I didn't want to have school. I miss a day of school for the storm, but. So. Sauerkraut became victory cabbage. Dachshund, victory or liberty cabbage. Dachshunds became liberty pups. Sauerkraut became liberty cabbage. Frankfurters became hot dogs. Hamburgers became Salisbury steak. Salisbury steak is a little town in England. And so that's what they named it. People with German names started to be attacked on the street. And remember, German Americans are everywhere. The biggest single ethnic group or single biggest ethnic group that immigrated to the United States, the Germans from Europe. The Germans, ethnic German. Most of my relatives who immigrated from Europe are ethnically German, and they were attacked on the street. German-owned stores were attacked. People were beat up. Some were lynched. Thousands of Dachshunds or other German breeds would be killed. Drawn behind cars or hung from trees and all this all. Why? That's war madness, isn't it? So, on my mom's side, maiden name Schutz. Schutz, German name. And my great grandfather, who never met, he died before I was born. But he had a little store, and it used to be a little tiny town south of Beaumont, Nebraska, called the Pavilion. And they had a corner market back when you had to shop every day. So you had to go to the little corner market and get what you need, free refrigeration. So the little store shuts the store, German. And so the big picture window for the display of his goods, and the store would be broken time after time. They would have, sign would be defaced, all kinds of stuff thrown into the store, sometimes lit on fire, things like that, attacking him all the time. He was jumped a number of times on the street, attacked, and refused to change. Thousands of families with German last names like Schmidt or Schutz or others changed their name to like Smith. Smith is an English name, but that's why there's so many Smiths in the United States, because he took that name in World War I. God, they did. I'll tell you a story about another story about him. Stubborn guy down the road, but it's good for him. But that was a normal thing to be attacked. That's war madness. And it happened a little bit in World War II against German Americans, but especially against Japanese Americans. Most of you know at least a little bit about that story. And that's going to happen in other wars. In fact, I remember 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq and tried to get other countries to join the United States. And almost all of our allies said, you're crazy. Iraq doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. They really don't have much of an army. They're no threat to anybody in the world, and it would turn into a horrible civil war. It turned out they were kind of right. Well, one of the leaders of our closest allies, who said, they're not going to help us, they're against this war, was France. And you would not believe the backlash against France in the United States. Some were insane how crazy it got. But the most famous, the U.S. House of Representatives has a cafeteria for its members and guests to go to. If you ever tour the Capitol, send a note, send an email to a local congressman, House or Senate, and they will take you as constituent services. They will take you on a tour of the Capitol. And I had a little bit. I've done it with the Senate and the House, and it's great. I mean, you get started in the House office buildings, go to the Capitol. It's much better than taking a tour to sign up for the Capitol. I highly recommend contact your local congressman. And so I did it with the first one with Conrad Burns, which is senator. And so that's you. And the House cafeteria is run by the House of Representatives, and they voted in the House of Representatives to change the menu because of anger against France to, instead of French fries, to freedom fries. Instead of French toast, they changed it to freedom toast. And France, one of our closest allies. But this happened just recently. There was a little bit of anger against Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine, even though so many people were for Russia too. But here's a guy dumping out vodka. Even though this vodka actually is not made in Russia, but vodka is kind of a Russian drink, I'll show the Russians. And no Russian mustard, which is just a style of mustard. Yeah, that'll show the Russians. That's a light example of war madness. So yes, it can easily happen now. So the other target were not just Germans of war madness, but socialists. Socialists were generally anti-war, workers killing workers as they saw. One of the largest labor unions was called the IWW, the International Workers of the World. You just need IWW, or everyone called them the Wobblies. Now, did a little bit about labor unions before. Everybody put down, they were very close to put down equals the Knights of Labor. They were close to the Knights. And like the Knights, they wanted one big union. And what they Wobbly said was the war is only a way for the wealthy to profit, for profiteers. There's a worker sowing the seeds of war, which is nothing but death, and yet they get the profits. Cartoon's a little bit off. I'm not sure it exactly works, but they're opposed to the war. The Wobblies were huge indeed. Huge. But remember, companies hate labor unions. And so they jumped on this and said that the Wobblies are traitors. Here we have the Kaiser, and you notice the face, IWW. And so, add this part. This became an excuse to attack the unions by saying that labor unions are pro-German. So, view, That's a symbol of the wobbly sapple cat too, right there. It was a big wobbly town. And Frank Little, 1917, or fall of 17, he went to Butte to speak out against the draft and the war. He was a very famous labor organizer. I guess gave an amazing speech. Over 10,000 people in Butte came out to hear him speak against the war. That gives you an idea of the power of the Wobblies, but also how controversial the war was. I should add, how big was Butte in 1917? About 120,000 people. So bigger Billings today, the big city of Montana. That's why Butte's a big ghost town. But there were also just as many of these vigilante groups, most commonly called the Liberty League, that warned about him speaking. Of course, Little was fearless, gave the speech, but later that night, vigilantes broke into his hotel with the help of the local police, beat him nearly senseless, and then tied him to a back of a car and drove him around town until he was dead. And then they hung the lifeless body from this railway trestle, which is still there in Butte. He was lynched because he was opposed to the war. And that shows you how war madness came to Montana. That would be the most famous lynching of the war. That is his funeral. And one of the warnings were put out harkens back to the vigilantes of early Montana, which I mentioned before. Since others take notice, first and last warning, 3777. 3777 are what Montana vigilantes would put out for those they were threatening, and that's the dimensions of a coffin. At least if you think. Doesn't quite work, but just go with it. And that's from vigilantes in Montana territory. I've told you about vigilantes before. The vigilantes were opposed to the territorial government of Montana. Even though they claimed they're out against robbers, there's no lawfulness. No, they hated the territorial government. Why? Union. Remember Thomas Francis Moore, the Hunter Brigade? He was murdered by vigilantes. Why? Because they were pro-Confederates. Remember, Helena was started by Confederates. So, they're using this imagery about Confederates. That 3777. That is on the shield for the Montana Highway Patrol Team. So people kind of forgot that whole thing about them being traitors and lawless thugs. But it's an interesting little bit of history. So of course we have a parade named after him. And, but I don't like to brag. I'm going to call it big shit. Give autographs later. But me, Mr. Larson, and Mr. Mahelish with big wigs at the vigilante parade. Natural, right? So show some respect to us. And at least we don't have our mascot. So I guess East Helena, they have 3777 on their uniforms. It's just people have no idea. So, Butte, America, one of the most famous examples of this kind of violence. So let's get to this. Shin versus the United States was a series of court cases that ruled on the espionage. And this one would make it to the Supreme Court. What amendment to the Constitution does the Espionage Act seem to violate? So everyone got that? They said it was a violation of the First Amendment. But the First Amendment does not guarantee freedom of speech. It just says that Congress cannot abridge the freedom of speech. So when the Supreme Court ruled, it said that this is not freedom of speech. Speech can be abridged if it presents a clear and present danger. Clear and present danger. And in the ruling, it said, gave this very specific example. Not all speech is free speech. For example, you cannot walk into a crowded theater and scream, fire, because you think it's fun to watch the panic. That presents a clear and present danger. So they're implying that speaking out against the political decision to go to war presents a clear and present danger. Or
demanding voting rights for women is a clear and present danger to the United States Constitution. Yes, that's the next step. So that shows there is no blanket freedom of speech. And yes, that is still the ruling today. That is still legal precedent to this day. So Eugene Debs, oh, you see those two women right there? They're in front of the White House, and they are demanding President Wilson carry out his promise for women's suffrage. And it said, Congress shall make no law breaching the freedom of speech, carrying the First Amendment. Because women are going to be arrested demanding suffrage in World War I. So, Eugene Debs, so everyone write down Debs. Debs would be in prison for demanding an end to the war, and he refused to back down. And you don't have to write this down, but even he never acknowledged the validity of the court. Debs knew he would go to jail, and this is his last statement he would make when he was asked to speak out before his sentencing. When he says criminal element, he's talking about political prisoners. And he said he will not quit fighting until we are all free. And that's his point of view. Remember, he's guy that got started. Pullman strike ran for president, did really well in 1912 as a third party, and he'd be imprisoned. Debs went to prison and ran for president in 1920. This cartoon shows it from a prison, looking out the front porch, trying to get to the White House. He was in an Atlanta federal penitentiary and would get 1 million votes. This would become one of the most famous political buttons in American history for president convict number 9653. And a lot of people believe, and I've been told this, that people in prison or people who are felons cannot run for office. It doesn't say that anywhere in the United States Constitution or any federal law. The current president is a felon, 34 counts of felon, and he is the president of the United States. So it doesn't say that anywhere. So yes, he could run. I thought about buying that. I saw that in an antique store, and I thought about buying it, but it was like $50. And I thought that's a little pricey for a pen that then what would I do with it? So while this is going on, women begin to enter the workforce. And so they took jobs that men had. In fact, but they very vocally said these are man's jobs, implying that when the men got back from the war, what's going to happen? What happened to the women? They'll be gone. 20% of women were working already in full-time jobs, and that went up about another 15%. Not as much as in World War II, but every nation, it showed that women could do the jobs men could do it well, probably not better. And what about these workers right here? How can they do the same jobs and be important for the war effort as men and not have the right to vote? Wilson promised to fight for the right to vote, and as soon as he became president, that became a secondary issue. And then when the war began, he said, well, we can't do it, we're at war. Have patience at the population. And that would lead to the last and most effective of the suffrage movements. Suffrage, the right to vote. Now, they've been fighting for this right to vote. Remember the Seneca Falls Convention way back in 1848? A few states had allowed women to vote. Montana allowed women to vote in 1916. That's after the fight of a significant number of women in Montana. Montana used to be a very progressive state. But that wasn't national. Alice Paul would take the suffrage movement into a new direction. And everybody write down that, speaking of direction, direct action. She said we got to act. We have to get into the face of politicians like Wilson, who promised they would fight for it. You are progressive, you said you would support this, and then didn't. It was purely a campaign pledge for them, they believe. This is Alice Paul right here. And right next to that sign, you notice that? Calling him Kaiser Wilson. You care about poor Germans? What about the 20 million American women that are on self-government, meaning cannot vote? And so, They began to direct act, do speeches, but the big thing they did is they made politicians, especially Wilson, unpopular. Every place they went, there were women protesting. Out in front of the White House protesting. They couldn't look away. You said you would do this. You can't escape. And what happened? Do you notice where Alice Paul is in that middle picture? She was arrested under what law? The Espionage Act. She was arrested under the Espionage Act. She would become one of the most famous political prisoners in American history. And a significant other women would do it. They copied the suffragette movement in Britain. In fact, Alice Paul went to London and protested with women who were demanding the vote in Britain. Said, you got to get in their face. Because then male politicians might say, oh, sure, we believe in rights for women. And then as soon as they are away, not in public, make them act. This is copying Frederick Douglass. Remember Frederick Douglass? There'll be no change unless there's protests. Change only comes when you make it. And I'm not going to lie, I very much admire Alice Paul. She's an amazing person. And incredibly courage, because while she was in prison, not only be the most famous political prisoners would be suffragettes, she would go on a hunt, and she is going to be force-fed, along with at least 20 other women. Now, they want their hunger strike because they're being held, and I should add, the federal government refused to have a trial. They denied them the right of habeas corpus because they do a trial would bring publicity to their case. So they kept pushing the trial back. And this is noticing treated as criminals. They're not, they committed a crime per se, except for demanding rights. Force feedings. It's horrific now. It was unreal then. So there's no pictures of this. They wouldn't have photographers in. So when these women were force fed, they do it through the nose. And they would do a steel tube a little bit wider than a straw, but it would be bent, kind of like a fish hook. And they would kind of get at an angle, pry it into their nose, and then down through the sinus. So it just rip apart your nose, it would break sinus bones, which, especially back then, there was nothing you could do. And it was, well, they say that protesters outside the walls of the prison could hear the screaming women were getting the folks' feet because it was a horrific torture. Then they took out a raw egg, ground up wheat gruel, and they would just pour it down their throat, pour it down, and sometimes that would kill them. And it was pure torture. It's telling everybody, you sure you want the right to vote? And that's the Espionage Act. So using the war to suppress everyone else. Remember I told you about totalitarian states? US did not go to that level. You see hints of it. That's the scary thing about total war. But this got the change. Progressives, both Republicans and mostly Democrats, who said they would support it, finally, by 1918, voted on the amendment that would become the 19th Amendment. Everyone called it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It got 2/3 of the House and the Senate. Wilson was still reluctant to sign it, but then finally did going into 1919. But then it needed 3/4 of states. Montana ratified it very quickly. I wonder if Montana would today. And 1920, the last state, Tennessee. Alice Paul had a flag where she hand sewed in a star for every state that ratified. And there she is sewing in Tennessee. Then she immediately fought for an equal rights amendment because women are guaranteed equal rights under the Constitution. That has never happened to this day. And those were women voting in 1920. So that's why suffrage is tied in with the war. At the same time, prohibition. So we've had temperance movements going into the 20th century. More and more was we got to stop alcohol. What it does to families, the money it costs, the poverty it leads to. Here we cause poverty and crime, we make people poor, but you notice one more thing, the Hun rule, German, implying that it was a German thing, especially German lager beer. And so it became a wartime measure to limit the production of beer because of German influence, but also think of the basics. It takes grain or corn or rice to make beer or spirits, alcohol. Shouldn't that be going to the troops and fodder for the forces? States started passing prohibition measures. This is one in Michigan. Montana passed one for partial prohibition. And they presented it as a wartime measure. And in the euphoria of winning the war, it said, if we're going to win the war and fight the war to end all wars, let's do it on the national level. And they hit that sweet spot in Congress where they're so euphoric over victory of the war to get enough votes to pass the 18th Amendment, and it shockingly went to the states like that. Every southern state voted for it. Montana voted for it very quickly, despite opposition from many, many places. And even though it was passed in Congress after the women's suffrage bill, it was ratified before it got 3/4 of the state. That's why it's the 18th Amendment. And immediately, Congress passed a law called the Volstead Act, how they would enforce it. Now, states would have to enforce it, but how do you make alcohol illegal? What's the federal law? This is what they did. They put a massive tax. They put 1,000% tax on the sale of alcohol. If you don't pay the tax, you're arrested. So if you put 1,000% tax, pay $1, or you sell alcohol, $1 with alcohol, and then you have to pay a $10 tax. How long will you be in business? What do you call somebody who then avoids the alcohol tax and ships it and sells it? So someone said, yeah, bootleg. They're bootleg. That's avoiding the tax. So, hey, let's have a pandemic. The Spanish flu. It started in 1917, two really big waves, especially the winter of 1918. A worldwide epidemic hit spread by the war. Think about the war, so everything. And it's going to be forgotten in a way almost. Look how many people died. 675,000 Americans. And we don't know how many worldwide. And this flu was different than other pandemics. It mostly affected people from the ages of around 15 to 35. Young men and women are the ones who most die. So you think about most diseases, pandemics like the one we just lived through, it's elderly or children. COVID was mostly elderly. And you think, okay, the disease is weakened or they're woo. There's a big spruce tree over there. And spruce trees. Somebody in this room might have a very large spruce tree in the front yard. So I'm very notice spruce trees. Other than you might have spruce trees or so survive the last windstorm. Time to get over it. So back to this. But this disease, when it hit, and it was so new, it noveled up the disease, brand new. Young people, their immunities were so much stronger than when they get older, that it reacted so fast that it sent bodies into shock and killed them. And that's why so many young people died of this disease. If you ever go to a cemetery, it is shocking how many people who died are in between, 10, 15, who died in 1918 to about 30. It is terrifying to go to the cemetery across from Carroll. It's unreal. Or another one where you see a lot of babies too. But the babies, why? Because their mothers was about the age. And so it spread worldwide by the war. And it's called the Spanish flu because both sides tried to censor the news because they didn't want the public to know how bad the disease was. They thought this might undermine the war effort. So newspapers were not allowed to cover this flu that was killing thousands. But the first time it hit the papers was when a flu was hitting neutral Spain, thus the Spanish flu. That's how come it's called. But it was influenza. It's still around, but we now have some immunities to it. And it hit where there are going to be disease or going to be vast amounts of troops. So, for example, this is the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Why Philadelphia? Because troops from Kansas would board a train and they would disembark the train from Philadelphia and then go across the ocean. I just told you where it began. Kansas. It began in almost certain. It began in training camps in Kansas. And they called these basic training camps during World War I concentration camps. I know the term hasn't quite got the connotation it has today. And it started there, then went to Philadelphia, and then spread all along the railroads and across the ocean worldwide. That is why this is the Philadelphia Naval Yard. I will say this, that it did end one horrible habit that people had during this time. Everybody spit on the ground, just spit all the time. And so it said, don't spit, because it spreads the disease. Yeah, I'm kind of glad. It's a horrible cost, but I'm glad the whole spitting thing is gone. So here is one. Yes, they have mask mandates. They didn't know about the mask. And masks, as long as everybody uses it, can be quite effective. Some people don't use it. It limits their effectiveness. Here, I do like that they're bargaining, selling this to avoid influenza, selling milk. That kind of reminds me of some of the quack stuff that came out during COVID. And this one shows it. We'll come back. The 1918 second wave started in cities, and then you'll see how fast it spread in a month, less than a month. Switch. Go. You can do it. It's doing it, doesn't it? Let me backtrack, try it again. There we go, watch. This worked perfectly fine last period. There we go. That's less than a month. So you think about how much faster it would be today. Mask. That's a mass grave in Philadelphia. That's how fast it hit. Now, COVID, 1.5 million Americans died, but mostly were elderly. So this one's different. Something very similar to COVID hit in 1890, and it was very similar. So, and here we have the same issues that happen today. The more things change, the more things remain the same. We have mask mandates, even arrested for not wearing his mask, re-shot and struggle with mask slacker. And they're the same kind of people today as then complain about wearing a mask. I don't have any sympathy for people who complain about wearing a mask. I had to wear a mask and it was awful and I did it. So did most of us, so toughen up. Sorry, I don't have sympathy for that. I should add one more thing. People kind of lost their mind. And it was so awful and so terrifying. So many people, it was spread so quickly that when it ended and you went through this weird kind of backlash that also affected the post-war years, then by the mid-1920s, everyone quit talking about it. They didn't want to talk. In fact, I literally was talking to somebody about COVID the other day about teaching. Another teacher, they said, I don't want to talk about it, it was so awful. And I remember for a lot of years, nobody was talking about this. It was hardly mentioned in history books. And I see something similar with COVID, and it wasn't even near as dramatic as that. So it's interesting how this just affects people. So everybody write down the 14 points. Just write down 14 points. Don't write, do not write this down. Just write down the 14 points. And 1918, Wilson came up with this idealized peace, January 1918. And he laid out this optimistic view that the war has got to be for something. And he laid out 14 points, which he presented as these 14 points, if we all agree to them after the war, will make sure there'll never be another war. Thus, the war to end all wars. And We don't need to know these. When I was a youth growing up, we had to memorize this. You write them down for a test. And I remember thinking how worthless that was because these didn't really happen. So we don't need to know them. We just need to know that Wilson presented this, but this became a symbol. Remember I told you about the Square Deal, New Deal political slogans? Everybody right down to this became a symbol for a peaceful world afterwards. Even though they were totally unworkable, it became a symbol. And let me get to one and then we'll move on. One of the big things is through various means, arms reduction. End the arms race. The arms race, remember the dreadnoughts were such a big cause of the war. If you limit the arms race, they'll be less likely to use them. Hey, if you have weapons, you use them. We're at war now. Let's do one more. Open diplomacy. No more secret deals. Everything's got to be an open. No more secret deals like the Allies gave Italy or the Central Powers gave the Ottomans. And so, yeah, these are the things we should remember. And if they would have carried them out, might be good. A few more tomorrow, then we get the last little bit of the war, and you'll be shocked how fast the war is. And do you see why this is such a big deal? We have so many things that go on in this. Total war, I don't need to explain total war again, but I had to go to it. Still exists today. Suffrage came out of this. What freedom of speech came out of this. Prohibition. We don't cover a lot of prohibition. Here we just don't have time. Special topics, we do a unit on prohibition, 20s, and gangsters. We learn about gangsters. And that's actually a very fun unit. And by the way, I heard again today that I'm retiring. I've heard from so many people that I'm retiring.
To this one.
They're trying to get rid of me.
There's a lot of people.
There's a ton of people retiring, yes. There's a lot of people retiring this year and next year. I'm not retiring at the end of this year.
You're gonna put like 300 people in there? I think insurance supposed to be like 50, or you make adjustments.